Hello folks, I'm Trev Makes It Easy, the channel where we make learning easy. In this series, Trev on Econ, I'll be taking you through topics you're likely to run into in any introductory course in economics at the college or university level. My goal is to make economics less scary, more approachable, and, if I can, mildly enjoyable. With that being said, let's make it easy. Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today we're going to build off of what we talked about last time and start to lay out the more core concepts around theory for elasticity. Now what I want to do in this video is basically talk about the different classifications or categories we can put elasticity into. In general, there's 5 main ones. 3 are sort of special cases. 2 are going to be cases you saw if you watched the last video, but these are where elasticity can end up. The nice thing is, even though we haven't really talked about supply yet, this applies to demand and supply, which makes it a little easier for students to get their head around. So if you notice, I've set up this little table here. There's 5 rows after the titles. We've got category, that will be the name of the type of elasticity. We've got the elasticity value, that will be what does the elasticity number have to be in that category, as well as a general interpretation, what does it mean to be in this category, and what a generic demand and supply curve might look like in terms of being in that category. Now, like I mentioned last time, slope and elasticity are not the same thing. So these are not, I would say, true representations, but they're a pretty good indicator that if you're this type of elasticity, your graph probably looks something along these lines. All right. Again, this is from a beginner lens, an introductory lens, so we're leaving out a bit of nuance that comes at higher levels. So our first category is the one that, it's named after, basically. You can be elastic. And elastic simply means that your elasticity, okay, is greater than 1. All right. Again, feel free to spell it out. I'm actually going to spell it out, just make it easier. All right. I know some people do not love the math symbols for greater than and less than, so I'm just going to spell it out to make things a little easier just in case. Okay. So elasticity greater than 1. Now remember, we always turn elasticity into positive. All right, at least for demand elasticity. Supply elasticity will always be positive. So we're not going to talk about negative numbers here. In fact, you're going to see in all the categories, we never delve into the negative numbers because they're just not relevant to us. All right. So elasticity greater than 1. So, 2, 3, 5, 1,000, 1,000,000, 1 billion, technically all possible. Like I said in the last video, usually you're dealing with like 0 to 3 from what I've experienced in teaching. But I guess technically you could go higher. And our interpretation here is just that the quantity changes by more than the price. So the price is going to change by some percentage. The quantity will change by more than that percentage. So for example, if price changes by 2%, quantity demanded or supplied would change by more than 2%, 3, 4, 5, etc. The idea here is that we are responsive or sensitive to that price change, right? The price changes, we respond almost violently, right? We change more than is expected simply because of numerous factors we'll talk about in a later video. But sensitive, elastic, your buying habits change more aggressively than the price changes, right? Now, what kind of thing would be elastic? A TV would be elastic, for example, right? You don't really need a TV. Okay, so if the price of a TV goes up 10%, you can just not buy a TV at all and reduce your percentage buying by infinite. All right. But if it goes down, maybe you want to buy a TV, right? So you might buy a percentage more of TVs. We haven't got to it yet, probably what the next video is going to be, but there are certain factors we can look at that help tell us what is elastic or what is likely to be more of the next category, which is inelastic, right? But for now, again, setting up the foundation, setting up those basics. Now, from a demand point of view, an elastic demand is likely to look more like this, okay? And really what we're saying here is it's a flatter curve. Okay, now again, I don't love this because technically it's not the same thing as slope, and we'll get to it later, but elasticity isn't the same on all points of this curve. But in general, and again, in a beginner's lens and an introductory course, we're going to say it's flatter, right? Same thing applies to supply. It is also flatter, just it looks a little different because it's upward sloping, so you might get something like this. All right, and we're basically going to do this for all the categories. So our next category is inelastic. As the name kind of suggests, it is the opposite of elastic. In fact, you can think of this as insensitive, right? Elastic is sensitive to something, inelastic is insensitive. I don't really care. Now, be careful with this one because it's not necessarily the opposite of inelastic, opposite of elastic for elasticity value, because in this one, its elasticity is between 0 and 1. Okay, so if you get an elasticity that is 0 point something, that is going to be inelastic. Okay, 0.1, 0.99999. Technically, those are all inelastic. Again, we don't deal with negative numbers because the negative numbers get turned to positive through an absolute symbol. If you don't remember why, go check out last video. All right, but this is again that idea of insensitive. So our interpretation is also fairly straightforward. It's the quantity changes by, there we go, less than the price, right? So this is the exact opposite case where when the price goes up by 2%, like we used in the last example, quantity only changes by less than 2%. So maybe price drops 2% and we buy 1% more. Or, price goes up 5% and we buy 2% less. All right. Our quantities just don't care as much about the price. And in your head, you can start to formulate what might fall into this category. Again, next video we'll deal with more specifics. But certain things, if the price changes, you just really don't care, right? You're not able to care, or it's too small for you to care. All right. So demand, in this case, well, it's going to be steeper. Okay, let's just make it fairly steep to prove a point. And for supply, same idea, opposite direction, right? We're going to get a quote-unquote steeper curve. Now, in general, these are the two categories that most things fall into. These are ranges, right? It's 1 to pretty much forever. It's 0 to 1. The last three cases are more unique. They are endpoints and specific values that have unique interpretations. All right. Some of them matter more than others. Some of them are just there because we need a word for it. And that actually leads us into the third one, which is, again, not super useful. It just is like a change point. It's called unit elastic. So unit elastic, like I said, doesn't really matter, to be completely honest. There's nothing I can think of off the top of my head that is like always unit elastic. It's just a point that happens to exist, because if we look at inelastic, that's from 0 to 1. But then after 1, we become elastic. So the unit elastic is like the turning point when elastic becomes inelastic and vice versa, right? So you can probably guess, but this is when elasticity is equal to 1. Okay. Again, there's not even really a specific good or service I can think of that really falls into this all the time. Sometimes things just do, pretty much. Now, again, you can probably guess the interpretation, but the quantity changes by the same amount as price. Again, all this means is that price goes down by 2% and we buy 2% more, all right? This can randomly happen. It doesn't really mean anything special is going on, but it happens in the wild sometimes. Doesn't matter. Not really, but again, I've seen it tested, so you might as well know it. Now, in terms of shape, Well, it's between flat and it's between steep, so we're just going to say it's 45 degrees. 45. Nope, let's do it this way. There we go. Make a degree symbol there. For supply, same idea. We're just going to say 45 degrees. Now, the next two, funny enough, are probably the most unique. All right, I'm going to scroll down just so we can get the room for them. These are the end cases. So elasticity exists on a spectrum from 0 to infinity. We know that above 0 to 1, or just below 1, is inelastic. Then we get unit elastic, and then we get elastic. But we need names for those endpoints. And here's where we get our very specialty cases. The first one is perfectly elastic, right? And this is where elasticity is infinity. Okay? It's a very strange concept. And it's arguable whether certain things actually fall into this category. This one in particular, the other case we're going to talk about, there are some things. But let's think about what this actually means. This means that the quantity changes by an infinite amount when price changes. So if price changes by 1 penny upward, so if price goes up by 1 penny or 0.1%, you drop your quantity to 0. And if price goes down 1%, you jump your quantity up infinitely. That's a very strange thing, okay? There is one case where you could argue that this exists, or at least a close case to this, and it would be something like farm goods. So let's take apples, for example. Without getting into, like, I don't know, the science or botany of apples, let's just think of like a normal red apple, okay? When I go to the grocery store and I go pick out my apple from the bin, the apples to me are all the same. I'm not really looking through and like trying to find out what farm it came from or what area it came from. Maybe you do. Maybe some people do. I don't. Okay. To me, all those apples are like perfect substitutes, right? I don't really care. So what that might mean is that if there's all these red apples and one of them is a slightly higher price, I'm just never going to buy that apple because I have all these other apples that are cheaper, right? So let's say the apple's $1 an apple and there's one apple lying there that's $1.01. I just have no reason to buy that apple, right? If I think they're all the exact same, I have zero reason to buy that extra scented apple. So because it went up 1 cent, I dropped to 0. I'm not buying it at all. But, you know, in the other extreme, if they're all $10 and this one apple is $9.99, right? Maybe I instantly scoop that one up first. Now, I'm probably not that sensitive to like a single cent of price change, but in reality, I should be, because if they're the exact same good and I want the cheapest one, I should snatch up the cheapest one. In reality, you know, things are more complicated. You start to care about like which species of apple it is, how they look, you know, you might care where they're from, etc. So again, the reality is more messy, but on a simple level, perhaps this is reasonable. All right. Now, what does that look like? Well, these have unique shapes and they are flat. Okay. So we're going to use, instead of flat, we're just going to say horizontal. Okay. You won't often see demand be horizontal. There is one section, if we make a video on it, where demand is horizontal, but it's pretty rare. Same thing with supply. It can happen. Again, don't get me wrong. It's a very unique case when it does. There we go. And then our final case, I don't know, it's called horizontal 1, but it is now. You can probably guess what this one's going to be called. It is perfectly inelastic. Right? And this one is elasticity is 0. Okay, it is the rare case where you have no sensitivity. No matter what the price does, there's only this much. All right. So again, the quantity changes by nothing, no matter what price does. Okay. I can raise price to the sky. I can put it to 0. It doesn't matter. I'm always going to demand the same amount. I'm always going to supply the same amount, again, depending on the case. Now, this one, like I kind of mentioned, does technically have some things that fall into it, okay? On the demand side of things, your closest thing might be a life-saving drug. So let's take something like insulin. So if you're a diabetic and you take insulin, you need a certain amount of insulin to stay alive, all right? If the price goes up on insulin, you can't really afford to take less because then guess what? You might die. But if the price goes down on insulin, you can't afford to buy more because you don't need more and it will kill you the other way. So things like life-saving drugs, they might have close to perfectly inelastic demand. You need a very specific amount, and if it goes above or below in the price, you can't really change your option and you get stuck having that amount. On the supply side, it's actually even more clear because on the supply side, think about something as simple as like a parking lot, right? I own a parking lot with 50 spaces. If I put the price to $0, there's not magically more than 50 spaces. It's locked in at 50 spaces. If I raise the price to $1,000 to park there for an hour, it doesn't matter. There's still only 50 spaces. Until some extraneous factor comes in and messes that up, maybe we build more onto the parking lot or we destroy part of the parking lot, that supply is going to be basically perfectly consistent. And we're actually going to run into this a lot with supply. Supply tends to be quite inelastic. In fact, it's not uncommon for supply to be perfectly inelastic. Another good example would be something like, consider a famous painting. Let's take the Mona Lisa. Right? How many Mona Lisas are there in the world? There's the one painting, right? Is there ever going to be more? Nope. Is there ever going to be less? I guess if it burns or something, but it doesn't matter what the price does. There's one Mona Lisa, all right? So this leaves us with a vertical curve, which again, you are likely to see this one, especially with supply, both in micro and macro. A vertical supply curve is not super uncommon. I will say a vertical demand curve is probably a little less common. Can happen, again, life-saving drugs or things like that. Probably not the worst thing in the world, but it is something that we see a lot less of, right? So these are our categories. A very common thing I see in courses is professors, teachers, whatever, will ask you to understand these relationships. I know a common question I like to use is I tell you maybe, I don't know, this part here, and then I expect you to know, oh, that must mean it's elastic, and therefore the elasticity is greater than 1. Or I might tell you, oh, elasticity is infinity. You should know that, oh, it has a horizontal demand curve, and it's called perfectly elastic. All right. You should know basically all the rows and what is in each row because it's a good way to have the fundamental categories, which again is a very easy thing to test, especially when we're talking about things like, multiple choice questions or things with fairly simple responses. Another thing we can also do is ask you to calculate things, right? We did all the calculations in the last video. If you calculate things, you get a number. Well, now you can look at this chart, put the number where it's supposed to go and say, oh, well, I got negative 2.3. Well, negative 2.3 becomes positive 2.3, and positive 2.3 goes into elastic because it's greater than 1. All right. It's that sort of connection which is very important in this chapter. And again, I find that it's one of those things where if you spend a little bit of time with it, it's pretty easy to pick up, which is nice. Now, that basically wraps up for today, but next time we're going to talk about the factors that make something more elastic or more inelastic. Basically looking at how can I tell just by looking or analyzing a good or service which of these categories it might fall into. All right, a very useful skill, and even after that, we're going to talk about how we can leverage that skill to make us some more money. It's going to be very helpful. With that being said, I hope you had a good time. Hope you learned something. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Well, folks, that wraps up another lesson for today. I hope it was helpful. If you found the video valuable, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about the content or requests for other topics or subjects you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment below. Until next time, keep learning and make it easy.